try not to fill the whole workshop full of smoke. But that is a pretty cool start to this episode. Stratos has not been getting a great deal of love on the videos over the last few weeks. I think the last time we mentioned it was probably 3 weeks ago, where we were working on the fuel rails. And it's one of those, anybody who works on cars will know that even the best laid plans, there's sometimes things that just come out of nowhere. And if you remember back, going back quite a few weeks, we had an issue with the O-rings on the thermostat housing being out of spec, even though they're the ones that came with the gasket set, and it leaked. We had a weep on that, which meant we had to take most of that apart. Then we had an upgraded cam belt tensioner set up, which was horrifically noisy and gave us a load of belt slap. So we ended up taking that back to the standard belt tensioner. And then we had the fuel lines, which were fuel rails, should I say, which were basically the original Alpha stainless steel rails that we'd welded AN type threaded fittings onto the end. One of those we had a weep on a weld, and we just could not rectify that. No matter how many times we tried to clean it back and re-weld it, it just always seemed to get porosity in the weld. So we ended up just cutting our losses on that and just saying, you know what, let's just start again and we'll do some billet aluminium fuel rails. So we made up some billet rails, got them on, and then coinciding with discovering that rail, that fuel weep, the reason we were down in that area to start with was because we had a lack of firing on this middle cylinder, on this back bank. And we could not understand why. We could not understand why. We were just going around the houses with it. It had compression. It seemingly had spark. Certainly the coil pack was firing. The plug was firing when we had the plug out of the engine on the lead. We can pulse all the injectors independently off the ECU. We pulsed that injector, that was working. It had fuel pressure. So, you know, we were then going through trying absolutely everything we could think of, because the charge cooler has to come off to get to that rear bank. It's best to try and cover all of those things in one go, rather than trying something, putting it all back, trying it again. So we flow checked that middle injector, which came back fine. We had the spark plug lead for that cylinder checked, just in case it was contacting enough to make a spark, but it was just a bit of a weak spark. That seemed fine. We noticed that the compression was slightly down on that cylinder, but we figured because the fuel, there was obviously fuel evidence in that cylinder, but it wasn't being burnt. We figured it had bore washed, and that would explain the slight drop. And we put a little bit of oil down the bore, and pretty much that brought the compression straight up. So we were just scratching our heads over it. We got it all back together once we'd done the fuel rails as well, and fired it up this time, and it was absolutely fine first time. And we can only conclude that cylinder, when it was very first started, overfueled a bit, flooded that cylinder to some extent, which washed the bore on that cylinder. That dropped the compression, and it just never fired on that cylinder since then. And that's all we can sort of come up with to explain it. But certainly now, it's absolutely spot on. No question, no problems at all. It's quite handy having the number of sensors we've got on this engine, mean that it's you can analyse a lot of data. So the first thing we noticed, which made us check whether that piston was firing or that cylinder was firing, was actually that we'd noticed an imbalance in the lambda signals. So we've got a lambda sensor on each bank, and one of them was reading significantly leaner than the other one. And that was basically caused by one bank not firing. And as soon as we noticed that, we checked, realised that cylinder, the exhaust wasn't going as gold as the others, which was a bit of a telltale. And then of course we could go through on the ECU and independently shut down the ignition on each cylinder until we noticed that shutting number 2 down didn't make any difference to how it was running. It was bizarre actually. It didn't seem to be running that rough audibly on 5 cylinders. But it is an incredibly smooth engine. We've been really impressed with that, and I think one of the reasons for that is the amount of effort that went into balancing this. So going back quite a long way now, when we built this engine, there's normally an offset weight in the crank pulley, and we decided that it should be possible to remove that if you could balance it out on the crank. And Bill Eales, who does our crank balancing, concurred that he thought it should be possible by boring out holes in the lobes of the crank and putting a heavier metal in there. And sure enough, he was able to do that. He bored it out and put tungsten inserts into all the lobes and balanced it out that way. And it is just absolutely beautifully balanced. So yeah, that's the Stratos. So moving on. Project Utah, Nat mentioned last week that the chrome had all come back. All that first batch of chrome, and we split the chrome into 2 batches on this. We knew there were various parts we were having bespoke made, like the grills at the front and the lamp bezels, which were going to take time, that needed chrome, but there were also quite a lot of chrome parts which would hold up other assembly work. So we split it into 2 batches, so we would have the chrome back that would hold up further progress. And the second batch is all items that are basically just exterior trim that can be added any time. So we can even get as far, hopefully, as doing some testing without having that chrome. So that first batch has opened up loads of progress, particularly the door builds. So we've been doing a lot of work on that. We've just got the frames loosely in at the minute. We've been getting the handles assembled and fitted. That's then allowed us to look at getting all the latch mechanisms in. We're doing the central locking conversion on it, fitting central locking motors on it. One of the things that has been frustrating though in this sort of last week of progress is it really just goes back to something we find time and time again, which is really substandard reproduction parts. And when we did all the chrome parts on this, we realised you could get the handles new, and we'd thought, well, we might as well get new handles rather than re-chrome the originals, because they're a cast item, and sometimes the amount of pitting you get in the metal they used of this era, which is often something called Mazak, can be very difficult to chrome to an acceptable level. So we made the decision to get new handles. And when we were fitting the rears, we noticed that this angle here does not match the back edge of the door. And straight away we thought, well, the suppliers obviously sent us 4 front handles rather than a pair of fronts and a pair of rears. Had a quick look at the part numbers, and then my suspicions were aroused a bit by the fact that the front 2 had part numbers on them, and the rear 2 clearly were the same but had the part numbers ground off. So we thought, well, that's a bit odd. I wonder if they're just selling front ones as rears. So we tried another supplier, a local place to us, and literally on the phone said, oh, we've got these door handles, it looks like they're all front ones. And then there was an immediate response, so they obviously knew this, saying, oh yeah, I think ours are like that as well. That's just how they are. But they do work. And we said, well, yeah, they work, but they're not quite the right shape. They don't match the door at the back. And the response was, well, depends how fussy you are about these things, which pretty much illustrates the level of detail that's generally accepted in the reproduction parts for classic cars world. And that was also extended to the door seals. We got what is claimed to be the most amazing, perfect fitting set of door seals for this car, which has a number of moulded sections and then sort of universal extrusion between. But it's absolute junk. I mean, the rubber's way too hard. It's going to make the door far too hard to shut. Where all the glued joints are really visible, and when you bear in mind that the seal, the original type seal, actually sits out into this gap, you end up with a join in the visible bit that you can see in the gap, or several joins. They're literally just laughable. So we kind of went back to the drawing board on that and just come up with a nice hollow foam capital D shape, if you like, extrusion. That's perfect. Actually, it's something like, I think it's about 15 mil deep by about 15 mil wide, slightly less. Fits perfectly into the original channel. Touches the door all the way around, but not so hard that you have to put any force to shut it. So that should hopefully be a really nice upgrade on that. So yeah, these are the sort of stumbling blocks you often deal with these car builds, where to the outsider who's never done this sort of thing, you think, oh, it's just bolting everything together at this stage. And yet there are still loads of stumbling blocks like that you don't foresee until you get onto it. But yeah, it's nice to be solving those problems, even though they are arising. We've obviously got the chrome gutter trims on there now. They look really nice. They went on really just because it was nice to get them somewhere that was a bit safer than being put on a shelf. Where else are we at on this? So James is just getting back onto the centre console design. We parked that briefly whilst he was on some other CAD work. Now he's back on it. He's just putting the holes in for the switches on that centre console piece, which completes the kind of mounting panel for it. Once we've done that, we're going to do the final mock-ups in there, and then we'll have the final incarnation of the actual fascia panel for that. will be water jet for the blank, then it'll be routed out to give us or machined out to give us the chamfers that we want on everything, and then that'll be prepped and then go away for hydro dipping with the wood grain finish, and then all the other panels for wood grain will go away with that. The steering wheel has come through. I think Nat mentioned last time, he showed the plywood rim for that being CNC routed. Well, the aluminium blank that attaches to is now back here. So that steering wheel construction is a sort of multi-stage process. Step one was drawing it all up. Step two was getting the plywood rim routed. Step three was getting the blank for the aluminium main frame of it water jet cut. The next step will then be having that machine, so all the finishing radiuses on the corners and also the detail on the spokes is going to be machined into it next, and also the chamfers on the mounting holes, or the countersunk, should I say. And then once we've done that, we'll be able to bond it all together, and then it'll be ready for wrapping in leather. So that's another avenue of progress on that. Let me just check my notes here a sec, see whether I've missed anything on that. Grills, yes, I think that's probably the last thing. So I think we showed them before, but the brass little grills that go in the front, they were originally horn grills on the earlier Mark IIs. We designed and machined our own version in brass, and Adam's just been offering those up and designing the mounting brackets that are going to clip those in. We wanted them to be really, really slim, because we don't want to, when you look through that grill from the front, I don't want to be able to see the brackets, and ideally not even the bolt heads of the bolts that are holding them in. So he's done a really, really, really subtle bracket design that just discreetly holds in behind. When we had those made, we had them drilled and tapped with them 4 holes in the back, so the brackets are bolted in from the back where you can't see them, and then they just go off to the side and bolt in with more little M4 dome head bolts into the sides of the body shell at the front there. So that's been done, and I think that's about where we're at with this. We're having the glass made at the minute that Nat, I think, showed being templated last time. That's for the side glasses. Front and rear screens are available off the shelf new, so we'll be getting new ones for those. And that's about where we're at on that. Gordon's car, we'll probably get some footage of this maybe for the next episode, but I was out road testing this yesterday because we finally had a really nice afternoon. Beautiful sunny afternoon, not a cloud in the sky, and yeah, I had a fantastic drive in it. It's the first time I think I've driven it and literally not had a single criticism on it. It's just been, it was just fantastic, and the weather always helps. We'd made a further tweak, which wasn't even something that Gordon had requested, but when I drove it out a few days ago, I thought the clutch is still a little bit heavy, and the engagement point's fairly high up in the travel. I figured we could go for a smaller cylinder. It's a smaller master cylinder. It was on a 0.625 inch master cylinder originally. So we've swapped that out for a 0.5, a half-inch master cylinder. And that's really improved the clutch. It just feels, the bite point's exactly where you naturally feel it should be. And it's really light. The power steering, we've upped the assistance sort of baseline. It's torque sensing, so the more assistance that is required, the more it gives. So the input at the wheel is relatively constant, but we can adjust the sort of baseline setting, and we've upped the assistance on the baseline setting, and I'm really happy with that now. Just feels perfect. Manoeuvring, it's really nice and light, but when you're out on the road, it's not excessively assisted. So yeah, just really happy with that now. It's back on the ramp just to do a final check over underneath. We're going to clean it, detail it all underneath, and then next week I'll be taking that down to Gordon and seeing him personally towards the end of next week. So I don't think it'll be long now until we hopefully get what we've been aiming for a long while now, of a final video with Gordon driving it, and I imagine that will probably get in some online videos elsewhere as well. So that's that. You'll see Kaiser 2 is lurking near the door. That's ready to be going out for more test drives now. It's kind of been in a queue of work. We were waiting for this to get off the ramp previously. Then it went on the ramp to do some modifications to the rear dampers. I've now got to take that out and check that that's remedied the problem we had there. And then there's a small list of niggles to go through on that. So I'm going to be taking that out, rectifying niggles, taking it out again. So that's that. And the Ascona lurking over there is going to be picked up tomorrow. So that will be freeing up some more space. So 2 of these cars are going to be going in the next week. So that is awesome. Let's go through this way. Oh, actually, before I do, I knew I was going to forget this. Very, very nice chap called Daraslowy, I probably said that wrong, so I do apologise if I pronounced that wrong, sent us some coffee and some biscuits from Canada. And just a really nice letter, sort of praising what we do. So thank you for that very much. Yeah, and also telling us that we shouldn't drink Bovril. So that's a good point, possibly. We're out of Bovril season now, though. It's all right. One thing I was going to quickly ask actually was we've got pretty good stock of t-shirts and hoodies at the minute, but I was going to ask for some suggestions in the comments on different lines of merchandise. I mean, mugs is an obvious one, but if anybody can think of anything else that they think would be a cool piece of merchandise for us to offer, that would be great. Now, if we have a little wander through here. So, really, Clive's tripping over stuff, making a cage to keep all the new employees in. Right, let's have a look at what Tom's been up to. So, Tom's been working on the CV8 over the course of the last week. I think when Nat last looked at this, he was in the midst of fabricating the new sections for these body side panels. So these, if you're not familiar with the CV8, these actually attach into the fiberglass body, all around obviously the window and door aperture. And then that whole assembly bolts to a separate metal steel chassis. And these essentially set the size and shape of the door aperture and keep that as a rigid piece, because there is no fiberglass that joins along the bottom here. That's a separate piece. And yeah, as is often the case with steel components on cars of this age, the rot was just kept escalating and escalating. I think last time Nat showed this whole lower sill section being built. Tom's made up these inner panels on this kind of box section here, which actually ducts air in from the front. And feeds it out into the ventilation system in the car. Complete new panel made there. While that was off, this has all been primed inside to try and keep the corrosion at bay further down the line. And then he's had to make various sections on this upper frame. So there's a new piece in here. He's been making new sections for this reinforcer piece on the actual door shut area, because of course where there's a spot welded piece, that's a classic area for corrosion to get in between the two skins. There's quite a bit in this area that joins. There's a piece here that's missing at the moment, but where that would normally be welded on here, there's quite a bit of corrosion there. So that's one of the next sections, and it's pretty much the same story on this one. Complete new inner panel on here, new reinforcer plate on the inside of the B post there, and a new section folded up here, and also this little plate that essentially just fills a little gap in between the body and the side frame there. That's had to be replaced on that one. So it's just been slogging away at that, and now moving on to the doors, which they're aluminium skins. They're actually a steel frame with an aluminium skin clinched over it, which is a classic area for corrosion to start. Even if it was all perfectly protected, that's just a classic area when you get aluminium and steel together. That bimetallic corrosion tends to set in. But in the case of Jensen, when the steel's also not very well protected, it just makes it doubly bad. So pretty much the entire lower section of the frame needs replacing on both doors, and there's loads of little repair areas all over the steel frame. It's quite interesting though, looking back at the construction method. If you look at the whole chassis actually, and things like the doors, you realise that it was quite a basic system of manufacture, and kind of, I guess it harks back to the fact that Jensen in these days was a relatively small outfit. It's almost all made from flat section, and particularly on the chassis, almost everything could be made with a folder, sheet steel, a folder and a saw basically. There's a few curved sections like these bottom parts of the doors, but even the chassis legs are essentially just huge lengths of big diameter tube. So it's all relatively straightforward construction, which is quite nice when it comes to actually making up repair panels, because although it's nice to take the time and make a good job of it, there's nothing particularly complicated in the shapes of a lot of it. So yeah, Tom's on with the doors on that. I'll have a little glance through here. Gaz is just masking up the Mustang for final paint. So I think last week he'd done the Raptor on the underside and on the inside. He's since done the Raptor on the inside of the wings, Obviously we want stone protection in there, so we wrapped her under there. Wrapped it inside the valances, same reason, you know, they're quite exposed to the elements, so getting a decent level of stone protection and corrosion protection on those is vital. And then he's been carrying on with the prep work on the smaller parts of the car, all the nose panels, the bits around the headlamps. The doors are an interesting one. On these Mustangs, there's an interesting construction technique on the doors where the interior trim panel is quite small. It doesn't reach to the very edge of the door. It's like an inset panel in the middle. But seemingly to create the impression that the whole door was an upholstered piece, there's almost a texture rolled into the steel of the inner part of the door. And I think in the factory this must have just then been painted the interior colour. So they must have, I presume, figured it was cheaper to do that on a mass-produced car like this than to actually upholster the inside of the door completely. Now on this one, we're doing the door, the interior exposed metalwork, like the dash and the inside of the door, the exterior colour. So we've had to basically bury that pattern with a decent heavy coat of primer and block it all back to get that texture out of it. So that's another thing that's been on with this week. But I mean, we're on final masking for final paint on this now. All of the wet sanding's done on the outside. So I would say, I don't want to stick my neck out and say it'll be painted for next episode, but it's certainly going to be getting very close to that. So that's where we're at with that, and let's go and have a look at the Chevette. This is a big change. There's been a lot of blasting going on this week. We did an Alfa Romeo for Gobs at Custom Restore. Real nice guy, actually. We don't often take on kind of standalone jobs like that, but we know him quite well, and he's a top guy. So we blasted a 105 Alpha, which good luck to him on it. It's a pretty rotten machine. But then we've also just today done the blast on this. So metalwork pace on this over the last week, because we wanted to round in a few blasting jobs together, has been absolutely frenetic, trying to get all of the remaining metalwork done so that today we could blast this, zinc spray it and epoxy it, and we have to do that in really quick succession, because you don't want to leave that bare blasted finish really any length of time at all exposed to the humidity in the air, because you'll start to get corrosion, you know, some level of corrosion, even if it's not very visible to the eye, which will then be sealed in. So it's important that we had this ready in the blast booth last thing last night, so we could literally start blasting it first thing this morning, blast it, clean it all out, get the zinc metal spray done, then get it onto a trolley, get it into here, and get the epoxy coat over the upper side of it. So at that point it's completely covered and sealed in. But the build up to that over the last week has just been a lot of metalwork. I mean, one of the biggies that we hadn't even started last episode, I don't think, was the seam brazing. So basically every spot welded seam on the car has been TIG brazed. I think Scott did all of that on this one. That's brazing using a TIG torch, but with a copper rod. And we do that just because it's a lot less brittle than using steel rod. It's actually a copper silicon alloy. It only has a tiny amount of silicon in it, but that brings the strength of the copper up to something that's very comparable to steel, but is considerably more less susceptible to cracking. One of the reasons particularly is because you tend to get porosity in a weld with steel rod. Whereas with the copper, the impurities kind of float to the surface during the process of actually welding it on there. So it's just a nicer way to do it, and it just that seam brazing process adds a huge amount of stiffness to the shell. We go around all the apertures. These obviously have to be ground back fairly carefully so that there's no bulging in the seals. But literally the edges of every open aperture, the door apertures, all the window apertures have been seam brazed, and then every spot welded seam throughout the rest of the car. We put these gusset plates on, which we made a while ago actually. We've just been waiting until we were doing the brazing because we knew we wanted to braze those on as well. And then some of the other details, it's all essentially been making provision for parts that are going to go onto the car eventually, some of which is plumbing and wiring related, some are other components. So if I start at the front, we're doing a headlight modification on this car. So we're running Hella xenon headlights on it, and we're making our own custom bezels that will fit into the front panel. They're going to be well, in fact, James has just been drawing those up on CAD this week. So once he's drawn those up, we're going to 3D print a mock-up version of that, just to make sure we're happy with the fit and the look. And Gaz will use those when he's in the bodywork stage to make sure the fit of the fiberglass wing to that bezel is good. They're eventually going to be machined from billet aluminium and anodized, and then they'll sit over the little round Hella Xenon units. The units themselves will bolt into a backplate, which will then be bolted to this flat surface. So we wanted to get rid of the original complicated headlamp aperture and just put a simpler bezel around there. So we've just done some simple backplates that are spot welded in for those. There's also, I think last week we were doing the mounts for the ballasts. There's some brackets that went underneath here, and we put weld bosses in to mount those, which hold the ballasts for those headlamp units. And then we've done the holes underneath here now, where the wires will feed up and come to those lamp units each side, and deleted the original wiring hole, which wasn't really in the place we wanted it. We've spaced those out to the same spacing as the lamps, so as the wires come up to the lights, they'll be nice and parallel. And then the provision for the wiring to those, so there's a hole here now where a grommet will feed a wire through to that lamp. It'll run across these weld bosses here, through that grommet. There's a weld boss under here, then that'll feed those lights on that side. Then there's a hole on the inner wing here and a load of weld bosses running down, which is where all of that front end loom will go, and then in through a hole in the inner wing down there, which then comes out right next to the mounting plate where we've designed bosses into the inner panel there, which is where the PDU will mount, which is the unit that will control all the electrical systems on the car. So the wire routing from that will be really nice. It'll just come straight off the PDU, straight out through that hole to the front. The rear loom will go down the sill, over the sort of inner arch at the back there, and then into the hollow section that's been created where we've bulkheaded off our fuel tank area to the rear lights, which also are going to be billet machine bezels with a more modern LED light inside, basically as per the front, our own design of light. What else have we been doing? So earth points, that's an earth point there. There's an M8 boss down here for the engine earth point. We've got a mounting boss here for the horn. We've done a fabricated plinth here, which is where the Mocal remote filter housing will bolt. And we've sort of finalised how we're going to do all the oil pipe routing. So we'll obviously have the dry sump tank here. That will feed down to the high pressure part of the dry sump pump. That then feeds across bosses which will be welded to the bottom tank of the radiator to the remote filter head. The other side of that then feeds the inlet to the engine, which is on this side. And then the scavenge pump then pumps back out. Pipes will come through here to the cooler, which we've already done the mounts for, and then back through to fill the tank. So the pipe routing will be really neat for that. We've done a mount down here for the fuel pressure regulator. We've also done all sorts of little details, like the washer tank is normally on with self tappers. We wanted to change that to riv nuts, so we've drilled those out to riv nut size. We've done a hole here for our battery bulkhead post, so there's a post that transfers the battery cable from the inside of the car to the engine bay, which will sit into a hole there. These two holes here are extinguisher jet holes. Fuel lines will come through those two down there. So it's basically just thinking forward and planning every part of the installation of all of the plumbing and making provision for that now. Over on the scuttle there, you can see there's two holes there for the extinguisher and isolator buttons. We've deleted the screen wash jets. We wanted spray bars on the wipers arms, so we've deleted the original holes. There's a little bulkhead hole here, which will be where one of the pipes comes through on a little 4mm bulkhead connector, where that pipe will then feed up to the wiper arm. It wasn't really necessary this side because we'll just feed it through the slots that are already in the scuttle there. So that's that. Mounts for the rear view mirror off the cage. We've got tabs on the cage down here for the extinguisher nozzles that will point towards the occupants. We've done a mount for the brake bias controller on the cage there. James has been working on the floor plates. That was one of the last things to go in. So you saw previously we were mounting a floor mount pedal box on the driver's side, obviously. That will sit onto a plate that sits right back into the footwell and creates a more visually appealing flat floor. And we're going to do a flat plate on the passenger side too. We've got a really cool technique for doing bosses in floors for things like that. So we CAD draw up the panel to start with the bolt holes in the places we want them. But then we do a version that's got big cutouts next to those holes, which allow you access through, and then we bolt the bosses onto the back, or lay the panel in and measure up what depth those bosses need to be, machine up the bosses, then bolt them to this template panel, sit that in. The access hole allows you to weld them into place, and then take the bolts out, take the panel back out, and it means that you've got a CAD drawing that you can use for the final footplate, which has got all the hole spacings exactly as they were welded into the car. So you're not faffing around trying to drill out holes because they're not quite in the right place. So that's quite a cool technique. What else have we done? There's some little threaded bosses in the tunnel which are going to hold some billet brackets which hold the Motec keypad over the top of the handbrake. We put that there, A, because it falls to hand nicely, and B, because that Motec keypad will then cover up the plumbing from the handbrake master cylinder, just make that look a little bit neater. We put all the holes in for the routing of the brake line to the rear there, the fuel lines from the fuel enclosure to the front, which will run down the passenger side of the tunnel. Moving on to the back, we put the mounts in, or the support rails for the fuel tank and the brackets, which will then bolt the straps to, which hold the fuel tank down. There's also various M5 bosses over this side. They'll hold a plate that holds the fuel pump and filter over there, and also clipping the fuel line up from where it comes from the pump and filter towards the bulkhead holes here, where they'll feed into the cockpit. All these brackets around here, they've been attached. They'll be what hold the brackets that allow us to clamp the carbon panel down onto here. So this piece here we previously showed, we'd cut out an aluminium template piece just to check that shape, but the CAD drawing for that will then be going over to the composites company we use, KS Composites, who will be making us a Nomex carbon honeycomb panel that sits into there. We've welded up the badge holes on the back because we're going to do our own badging on this. Plan there is to use the Vauxhall script font, but make our own machined letters. This is Project Vader, if you hadn't picked that up already. The reason for that will become more obvious as it makes its transformation to being black, and we'll probably do the Vader lettering on the back there. We've done a little screw-in towing eye, so there's not really a good towing point on these. There's some lashing points further forward, but they're not very convenient. So we've done a threaded piece under there and made a threaded-in towing eye, so you can take that out when you're not using it. And I think that's probably about it. There was a lot of going around welding up little self-tapper holes for old bits of trim where the sides of the parcel shelf used to go, for example. There were loads of little self-tapper holes in there. So the goal really is to try and weld up all of the holes that we're not going to be using, and then obviously put holes in for everything we are going to do. Inevitably there'll be something we've missed and we'll have to drill a hole somewhere, but the idea is to try and get as much of that as possible, and I think we have. So really looking forward to seeing this transform now. It's over to Gary really now to start prepping this. He's going to probably start with the seam sealing and general prep work on it. And these motorsport type builds are always demanding on the prep, particularly on the inside, because there's just so many nooks and crannies that are going to be seen and need to be in a visible painted finish. Whereas actually you'd almost think a motorsport build should have a cheaper paint job, but actually, if anything, they're more difficult, because on a road car, the inside, you basically just make sure it's well prepared, cover it all with something, Raptor usually in our case, but the exact finish of it isn't that critical because it's all going to be covered with carpet or trim. Whereas on this, the vast majority of the interior metalwork is going to be visible, so there's a lot more effort has to go into the prep work. And then if you get into things like contrasting coloured roll cages, then it becomes an absolute pain in the bum, because the amount of masking you have to do to mask out the rest of the shell when you paint the cage or vice versa, and then trying to get in and trying to get a decent finish on all the sides to it, it's a demanding job. So I don't envy Gaz's job on that one. And on that note, I think we'll end. So we'll see you next week and see how we're getting on then.